Most stories treat endings as something sudden, a final moment where everything collapses, where something breaks, where the result appears all at once. But Ragnarok does not work like that. It is not a sudden ending, it is something that has been moving forward long before it arrives. It is not a surprise. It exists in the background of every decision the gods make, shaping their actions even when it is not directly visible. And that changes the way the story functions. Because when an ending is known in advance, it does not simply wait. It begins to influence everything that happens before it. In Norse mythology, Ragnarok is not just an event, it is a certainty. The gods are aware that it is coming. They know that the world they exist in will eventually collapse, that the forces they have tried to control will break free, and that the balance they have built will not last forever. This is not something they discover too late. It is something they understand while they are still in a position to act. And that awareness creates a different kind of tension, because the question is no longer whether something will happen, but what happens in the time before it does. It forces every decision into a new context, where actions are no longer just about the present, but about delaying or managing something that cannot be fully stopped. The gods respond to this knowledge in a way that feels familiar. They prepare. They reinforce what they already have. They try to strengthen the system, to make it more stable, to hold things together for as long as possible. They do not accept the ending as something immediate. They treat it as something that can be delayed, something that can be pushed further away through effort and control. And for a time, that approach appears to work. The world continues, the system holds, the structure they rely on remains intact. But beneath that stability, something is already moving in a direction that cannot be reversed by effort alone. This becomes clearer when looking at the decisions made before Ragnarok ever begins. Fenrir is bound, Loki is imprisoned, Jormungandr is cast into the ocean. Each of these actions is taken to maintain order, to remove what does not fit within the system the gods are trying to preserve. And in the moment, each decision feels justified. It removes an immediate threat. It creates stability. It allows the system to continue functioning. But those decisions do not eliminate what they are trying to control. They displace it. They push it forward into a future that is already known, but not yet visible. Over time, these choices begin to connect. What once felt like isolated decisions starts to form a pattern. The things that were forced out of the system do not disappear. They grow, they change. They continue to exist outside the structure that rejected them. And because they are no longer part of that structure, they are no longer shaped by it. They become something separate, something that moves independently. And when that independence reaches a certain point, it can no longer be contained by the same methods that once seemed effective. When Ragnarok finally begins, it does not feel like something new. It feels like something that has been building for a long time, finally reaching a point where it can no longer be held back. The signs appear first. The world begins to shift. The stability that once defined everything starts to weaken. Boundaries begin to fail. Fenrir breaks free. Loki escapes. Jormungandr rises from the ocean. These are not sudden changes. They are the release of what was already there, what had been growing beyond the control of the system that tried to contain it. The gods do not avoid what follows. They confront it directly. Odin faces Fenrir. Thor faces Jormungandr. Each of these encounters is the culmination of something that has been developing long before the battle itself begins. These are not random conflicts. They are the final points of a pattern that has been moving forward for a long time. And in each case, the outcome reflects the same idea. The system does not collapse because it is weak. It collapses because it has reached the point where it can no longer sustain itself against what it tried to control. Odin is killed by Fenrir. Thor kills Jormungandr but dies from the poison that remains. Loki and Heimdall destroy each other. These outcomes are not just the result of the moment. They are the result of everything that led to that moment. The effort to maintain control did not fail in a single instance. It reached a point where it could no longer continue, because the forces it acted against had already developed beyond the limits that were placed on them. Yet Ragnarok does not end with nothing. After the destruction, something remains. The world does not disappear entirely, it changes. A new version begins to take shape. This is what separates Ragnarok from a simple collapse. It is not just an ending, it is a transition. What existed before cannot continue, but something else emerges from what is left behind. That shift does not undo what happened, but it shows that the ending was not absolute. It was part of a larger cycle that continues beyond it. This is where the story begins to connect beyond mythology. The idea of something being set in motion does not only apply to large, world-ending events. It appears in smaller systems, in patterns that develop over time, in decisions that seem isolated at first but gradually form a direction. Once something begins moving in a particular way, it becomes harder to change that direction the further it goes. Each step reinforces the next. Each decision makes the following one more likely. And over time, the outcome begins to feel fixed, even though it was built through a series of choices that could have been different earlier on. People experience this in ways that are less dramatic but follow the same structure. A pattern forms slowly. A set of decisions begins to repeat. That repetition becomes something stable. And eventually, it becomes something that feels difficult to change. Not because it cannot be changed, but because it has been allowed to continue long enough to establish its own momentum. At that point, the question is no longer about what could have been done at the beginning. It becomes about what can be done now, when the movement has already carried forward. Ragnarok represents that idea at its largest scale. It is not simply the destruction of a world. It is the result of something that has been moving toward that destruction long before it becomes visible. The battles are not the beginning, they are the conclusion. And by the time they happen, the possibility of avoiding them has already passed. That is what gives the story its weight, because it shifts the focus away from the moment of collapse and toward everything that led up to it. The story does not suggest that endings can always be avoided. It suggests something more specific. It suggests that the direction of an ending is often set earlier than it appears, and that recognizing that direction matters more than reacting once it is fully formed. Because once something is clearly visible, it has usually already reached a point where changing it is far more difficult than it would have been before. That is the question Ragnarok ultimately leaves behind. Not whether something will end, but when that ending truly begins. Because in many cases, it does not begin at the moment everything breaks. It begins earlier, in the choices that set everything in motion. And by the time it becomes visible, it is no longer a question of whether it will happen, but whether it could have been changed when it first started moving in that direction.